Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to talk to you about the concept of a palindrome and the Python debugger. Now what is a palindrome? Well, a palindrome basically is a word that is spelled the same way both forwards and backwards. So the word civic, for instance, if you write it out normally, it spells the word civic, but if you actually kind of spelled that word in the backwards direction, it would still spell out the word civic. Similar for a word radar or the word rotator, and there are other palindromes also, but it's basically, that's the idea. It's a word that if you flipped the letters completely, it would still spell out the same word. So what I want you to do is I want you to try to figure out a correct implementation for a function that can tell us if a word is a palindrome or not. So the function should have one parameter, which you can expect will be a string, and your function just has to look at that string and determine either true or false, is this word a palindrome? So what would you do to implement this function? Think about it and try to select a correct implementation. So here's some code, but I want you to take a close look at it and I want you to try to tell me, is this implementation actually correct? Did I do things right in this case, or is there something about this code that may, in some cases, produce an incorrect answer? Well, there is actually an aspect of this code that is incorrect, but let's test it. And by testing it, it should be able to kind of show that it's not correct. So based on those two test cases, the first one should print out false because contemporary is not a palindrome. And the second one should print out true because it is a palindrome. But if I run this, we end up with true and true. So it is saying that contemporary is a palindrome, but it is not a palindrome. So something is wrong, and we have to try and identify why. Now, when you are working on your coding assignments, you may encounter situations where you've written a function and you want it to do a particular task, but then when you run it, it doesn't do what you expect, or you don't get the right printout, or whatever the case may be, or you don't see the right result on the screen. So it's important to be able to try to identify, okay, I have something wrong, but how do I go about figuring out where this issue is? Where is the issue coming from? What's the source? Is it one particular line? Is it multiple lines that are wrong? What is going wrong? And in this case, I did not get an error. It's just that I got the wrong answer. So this is not just, oh, I can look at the error message and figure out what line it says because I don't have an error message. I have to go and do the investigating to figure out what line of code is the problem. So if you don't have an error message, it in some cases can be more tricky because you have to do more of the investigative kind of work, which is what we have going on. In this case, no error message, right? So what I want to talk to you about as a tool that can help you with this is the Python debugger. So on the Mu editor at least, there is a debug button that you can press, and you can actually use this to help you debug and kind of analyze these sort of situations. And basically, if you, instead of clicking the Run button, if you click the Debug button, you should be presented with a menu that looks something along the lines of this, where you can still stop your program, but you can also have these extra capabilities of stepping over, stepping in, and stepping out. And basically, these buttons allow you to kind of walk through your code as it is running to see what's going on with that code. So let's try to apply the debugger to this palindrome function to help us figure out where things are going wrong. So what I'm going to do is you can hit stop, and then you can hit debug instead of run. And notice what you get is it highlights line 1, and we also get this extra panel, which basically gives us names and values. So this is going to, for now, it just tells us basically the name of the file and this other name, but eventually as we get variables, it will actually show us variables and what the values of those variables are. So if I say step, what do I want to do? I want to step over, so it jumps down basically to the next line, and you can see it also added a name, so it now knows about the isPalindrome word function. But then if I want to kind of go into this function call, right, this is the one that was problematic. So if I want to follow the execution of this code into the function, I would click step in. And so now I can actually walk through what's going on with this function call line by line. So if I say step over and step over, notice that for each one of those step overs, it added a new name. So it has the forwards and the backwards variable. Backwards as of line 4 is empty, and forwards is the full word, contemporary, right? So now we need to figure out, because the problem could have something to do with maybe we're not creating the backwards word correctly, because ultimately what we're trying to do at the end is we're basically, with this code, we're trying to build a backwards version of the original word, and then we're checking to see if those two things are the same. If they're the same, then it should be a palindrome, if we're building backwards correctly. So I can keep clicking step over to kind of go through the cycles of this loop. But one of the things you might notice as I go through this, the backwards word is getting words or letters prepended to the beginning of it, but it's basically just building the word contemporary from the end to the beginning. So now when we get to the point of checking if those two things are equal, well, of course they're equal. It's because we just reassembled the same word, contemporary. So this is obviously building that backwards word wrong. And by using the debugger, it can actually visually show you, if I expand it, it can visually show you that's what your backwards variable is and that's what your forwards variable is. And so it is like, oh, well, of course, I'm doing that wrong. Now, another thing you could have done in this case is you can also debug programs simply by adding print statements, right? I could have added a print at this point right after or right before line 8 to print out forwards and backwards and see what they were. But another way to do it is the debugger. So now that I've seen that, it's like, all right, I can stop, or I could continue going. I could step in and keep going through the program, and I could step over that call, step in, and then finish. But now I need to fix the way I'm building the backwards. And really the fix here is if I just swap these so that it puts the letter in the correct position, I can then, let's go and debug and see it. Hopefully it's building it correctly in the other direction. So if, it'd be nice if it didn't keep resizing that name column, but now it's actually building contemporary backwards. And so then by the time I get to returning, it correctly identifies, see it says B1 is false, so it correctly identifies contemporary is not the answer. And if I just run it regularly again, I get false and true, which is what we should get. So like I said, another thing that could have been done is you could just say, well, let's print, forwards and backwards. And we could even add a print to say print backwards at each iteration. And then if I had it the old way, we would have been able to tell by adding prints that it was building basically the same word from backwards from the end to the beginning. So printing is a completely valid way to debug programs, but also keep in mind that you have that feature of the debugger if you need it. If you'd rather kind of walk through those lines and have that little extra panel to see the values of variables and functions and so on, you're welcome to use that for this class when you're working on assignments in particular. So there we go, right? By using, let me put it back to the correct answer. So by using the debugger, it was able to help us determine what was wrong with this function. So just keep that in mind as a tool in your tool belt, basically. So now we have a correct implementation of this function, but is there a way that we could try to do this with less lines of code? So can you think of anything that we could do in this to kind of shorten it up to make it a little bit simpler? What do you think? So a few options. So one is, this only shortens it up basically by one line, but we could use a while loop. And basically what we do is we go through the indexes, but we're comparing, if we go, the I variable starts at index 0 and goes forward, but then we also put this formula to kind of get the corresponding letter later on in the string. So we'd get the two ends, and then the next one's in, and the next one's in, and keep comparing those. And if we see any that are not equal, that would indicate it's not a palindrome. And then if we get through the whole thing and do not, if this if statement condition is never true, then we just return true, indicating that it's a palindrome. So that just saves us one line of code. We could also do a similar concept, but with a for loop that saves us an additional line of code to get this even shorter. And we could even go all the way to this. This might look a little bit funky and weird, but basically what we're doing here is we're doing a string slice, kind of a special string slice. And that line of code, whatever is in a word, that will basically give you the reverse of that word. So essentially, if you think about what this is doing, if you don't have a number before the first colon and after the first colon, what that does is it's basically going to give you the entire string. So slice the entire string out. But if you give it this third value, that basically kind of tells it to slice it out, but slice it out going backwards through the string instead of forwards through the string, which ends up giving you the same string in reverse though. So if this is equal to whatever the original word was, then that would give you the answer to whether or not it is a palindrome. So this kind of is an example of you can get problems in computer science and there can be more than one way to solve that problem. In fact, in some cases, there can be many ways to solve one individual problem in computer science. So we have kind of a longer, more verbose way of solving the problem. And there's some slightly shorter, and then very short way of solving the problem. And so just keep that in mind, right? There isn't always just one right way to do something. There is, in our case, within the restrictions that I give you for this class, you're not supposed to be using advanced material, and occasionally I tell you you must use this or you shouldn't use that. But generally, there's often many ways to solve a given problem. All right, so another kind of building off of what we just did, imagine you could actually have a function that would tell you if an entire sequence of words was a palindrome. So for example, if you had the words 1, 2, and 3, if you flip those in reverse, that's not a palindrome. It won't spell the same thing. Now, if you had this, Olson is in Oslo, well, if you include the spaces, that's not a palindrome. But let's think about the following. If I took this string, and if I were to, let's leave that in there. If I were to get rid of the spaces, this actually ends up being the same forwards and backwards, because you have Olson is in Oslo. So what I want this function to be able to do is basically tell me if something is a palindrome, but ignore spaces if a space exists, in the input value. So how should we try to do that? All right. So to ignore spaces, there's a few ways that we could go about this. So one way, this is kind of a full implementation, where what we do is we take our string and we use that split function to split and basically get a list where we have all the individual words and we try and separate out the spaces. And then we basically, using a for loop, we put the string back together, but without the spaces. And then, if we have that working, we can basically take one of the algorithms that we had before for our is palindrome word function, and we can just use, in this case, I think we're using the while loop version. We can just use that to tell if it's a palindrome or not. So get rid of spaces, and then use one of our algorithms that we already developed, that I already showed you. So that's one way to solve it. Another way, there's a few ways that we could shorten this up, though. So one is this code, the code, that loop basically, that's recreating the string without the spaces. There's a function that I'm actually going to talk more about in the next video that allows this job to be done very easily. And that function is the join function. Basically, you can think about join as it kind of can do the reverse of what split does. With split, you can take a string and split it up based on particular characters or based on white space. And then with join, you can tell it if you have a list, so for example, string split, you can say take whatever, or basically whatever this string is, and join together the elements in that list and put this string in between. But in this case, that's just an empty string. So we're just kind of putting all the words together without spaces in between. And then we do the rest of that while loop algorithm that we had. Now, there's even yet another way that we can shorten this up more, is if we already have an isPalindrome word function, why not just use that function? So we could, instead of doing this work, we could just call is palindrome word, right? Instead of let's not copy and paste code. If we have it in one function already, let's use that code. So let me take this, and like I said, I'm going to talk a little bit more about join in the next video, so don't worry if you didn't fully follow my quick explanation there. But let's test and see if this is working. So we want to get rid of that, 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 and that. And let's just print directly out the results. So print, 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 print. So we should get 3 trues first and then 2 falses at the end if it's working correctly. And indeed, we get 3 trues, 2 falses, is palindrome works correctly. So there we go. Hopefully that example going over what palindromes are and how to use the debugger, hopefully that's helpful in understanding just some different aspects, particularly of the debugger. And I would encourage you, if that seemed interesting, if that seemed like a tool that you would find useful when you're working on your assignments, go experiment with it, right? Take some of your programming assignments or your prep problems or whatever you've worked on for this class and just try walking through it with the debugger and getting used to how it works, getting used to looking at the values of variables and those kinds of things. And just play around with it and try to get familiar with it in case you really come to a point where you need it for helping you with an assignment, for example. So anyways, that'll be all for this video. I'll talk to you in the next video, and have a good one.